So, good day everyone. I am CG Siga and I am here to report about National IP or Indigenous People Education Policy. But before I will start my discussion, I would like to apologize for the unnecessary backgrounds. Do you have any idea o kinsa ning mga indigenous people o nga nang gitawag ni silang indigenous people? And ato sa ni silang ila-ilahon. So, indigenous peoples are the holders of unique languages, knowledge, systems, and beliefs, and possess invaluable knowledge of practices for the sustainable management of natural resources. So, they have a special relation and the use of their traditional lands. So, ang kaning mga indigenous people are the distinct groups or distinct social and cultural groups that shares collective ancestral ties to the lands and natural resources ug asa sila nagpuyo or occupy or from which they have been displaced. So, in consolidated report by the Episcopal Commission on Indigenous People in the Philippines, there are 30% indigenous people in Luzon, less than 10% in Visayas, and more than 60% in Mindanao. So imagine ug unsa kadaghan ng indigenous people sa ato ang country, which is the Philippines. We all know that mostly ang problems aning indigenous people bitaw is being discriminated and prejudiced. So pwede nila ma-encounter through other people, and the educational system itself, which has been lacking of eliminating prejudice and discrimination. So mostly indigenous people are often lacking or has the difficulties in comprehension, in which it results to the poor quality of their education. So wherein some of their cultures, language, etc. are not being taught in the school, and punan pa jud nga lacking kaayo sila og kanang collaboration towards their peers, and kanang if a certain group of students kay naka-feel og nay usa ka student ka di jud nila belong, so ilang gi-discriminate og maayo, in which it results due to poor quality of education. So according to DepEd number 32 series of 2015, the need for teachers in serving in indigenous communities to be adequately oriented and trained so that indigenous cultures are appreciated and indigenous cultural practices and values are not discriminated as backwards, inferior, invalid, or primitive. So for example, being a teacher, kay mostly ang work sa teachers is to teach students with different backgrounds. So if you have the possibility to teach indigenous peoples, you must be properly directed and taught so that ang kaning mga indigenous peoples kay maka-feel og comfortability towards nimo. And dili lang kay ang comfortability ang ilang mag-gain, but also imo silang i-transform to get their confidence to speak up and be heard sa uban. That's why, since the Philippines has a large numbers of IPs or indigenous peoples, the government through the Department of Education had developed a curriculum to cater the rights of these indigenous peoples for their education. So by addressing these kanang issues or problems towards kanang indigenous peoples, so diri na nisud on August 12, 2011, press release prepared by the Department of Education. The Department of Education, or DepEd, recently released an education policy framework for indigenous peoples, or IPs, that aims to make the Philippine educational system truly inclusive and respectful of the diversity of learners, especially those belonging to the minority groups. And here you are. Here's the policies that were implemented or developed. So, in DepEd Order number 32 series of 2015, this Indigenous Peoples Education Curriculum Framework is pursuant to the DepEd Order number 62 series of 2011, which is entitled Adopting Indigenous Peoples Education or IPED Policy Framework, and is also pursuant to the DepEd Order number 43 series of 2011, which is entitled Implementing Rules and Regulation of Republic Act number 10533, so Enhanced Basic Education Act of 2013. So the first policy, so since these policies are really long, so that's why I'm focusing, or I'm just rooting for the main focus of these policies. So according to DepEd Order number 32 series of 2015, recognizing the right of indigenous peoples to basic education that is culturally rooted and responsive. So the IPED curriculum framework seeks to provide guidance to schools and other educational programs, so both public and private, as they engage with indigenous communities in localizing, indigenizing, and enhancing the K-12 curriculum based on their respective educational and social contexts. So the purpose of this policy is to seek and provide guidance to schools and other education programs, both kind of public man siya or private, as long as they recognize the rights of indigenous people to basic education that is culturally rooted and responsive. So in the next policy is the DepEd Order number 62 series of 2011, entitled National Indigenous Peoples Education Policy Framework. So to serve as an instrument for promoting shared accountability, continuous dialogue, engagement, and partnership among government, IP's communities, civil society, and other education stakeholders in upholding the IP's learners' education rights. So what does it mean? It means that it was created to shared accountability, or to promote shared accountability in which, or towards safeguarding of the IP learners' educational rights. So on the last policy is, according to DepEd Order number 43 series of 2011, strengthening the school health and nutrition programs for the achievement of the Education for All, or EFA, and Millennium Development Goals. It means that by achieving Education for All, or EFA, and the Millennium Development Goals by developing school health and nutrition programs. Now, let's move on to the key elements of IP education curriculum. So first on the list is the strategies for teaching IP learners. So first is establish a relationship between the indigenous communities and the school so that they learn from each other. So on the first strategy, it talks about more on kanang partnership. So to learn from each other, especially those indigenous people, so dapat mag-establish sila o partnership between the indigenous people and also for the school. So second is to ensure all teachers have a thorough understanding of the residential school system and an understanding of the impact of colonization. So here, the teachers must ensure that all instructors have a solid grasp of the residential school system as well as colonization's impact. On the third policy is to create school policy that advocates for and supports inclusion of indigenous students. So diri, dapat ang school must provide the inclusiveness of each students ug unsa pa na sila nga klase nga students. So dapat mag-promote sila and support the indigenous students inclusion. So dapat kanang walay man left behind. On the fourth strategy is to understand that many indigenous students face racism on a daily basis. So mao ni akong giingon ninyo nga ang kasagaran problems or issue towards these indigenous peoples are being discriminated and kanang they are subjected, or there are a lot of indigenous students that are subjected to prejudice on a regular basis. Fifth strategy is to develop zero tolerance policies on racism. So this is very important because being a teacher, if you're a teacher that is teaching indigenous students, dapat ipa-feel jud nimo or dapat zero tolerance jud ka towards sa imong students. Dapat imo jud nang ipalabi ang anti-racism sa imong mga students so that kanang maka-prevent of discrimination. And the last strategy is to engage the students at a physical, emotional, and mental, intellectual, and spiritual level by using a variety of teaching methods. So, being a teacher, dapat inside the classroom, dapat makahuna-huna na ka og different strategies ug unsaon nimo imong mga students to feel or to gain comfortability towards nimo as a teacher. So, ang kaning pag-make nimo og mga activities or different activities towards sa imong students, mao man ni siya ang usapod ka way para mas open sila nimo, mas maka-feel sila og trust and safe towards nimo as a teacher. And we are done with the strategies, and now let's move on to the learning space and environment. So, create an environment that is safe for indigenous students, safe enough for them to share if they have been the target of racism in the school or if troubles at home are impacting their studies. So, in the learning space, ang teachers jud mo'y has ang dagko kay og responsibilities towards ani. So dapat ang teachers kay mag-create og safe atmosphere baron for these indigenous kids, and dapat kanang it allows them to speak out whether kanang naka-experience pa sila og racism or kanang sa school, racism sa school, or kanang problems that are kanang nag-interfere nila that affects towards their academic. Next is to create an environment that is safe for indigenous students to feel comfortable and proud to share information about their culture and history. So, dapat, as a teacher, mag-create ka o kanang comfortable ka nga settings in which kanang maka-feel sa dang kaning indigenous students nga safe sila nimo, as what I have said kaganina nga kanang these indigenous students kay need you to speak up and be heard. That's why kanang imo sila gaano possibilities nga maka-share og kanang facts about their kanang culture and histories. And the last one is to create an environment where humor and group talk is encouraged, respected, and accepted. So, dapat mag-create ka og environment that encourages, respects, and accepts humor or kanang mga group chats. So, all in all, ang goal ra ani bitong kaning national IP or Indigenous People Education Policy is that kanang it creates curriculum framework that kanang ang indigenous people have the rights to access the kanang quality of education, because kanang as what I have said, this is not a privilege, but this is a rights because they are human rights. So kanang dapat gaan jud nato sila og rights, dili sila dapat nato sila pasagdan. It is because they need our help. They need the government's help. So, and for the teachers, when teaching all students, regardless of their cultural identification, it is vital that the teaching strategies used are effective and relevant for the students, especially for these indigenous students. For engaged learning to take place, the educational experiences offered them must be focused to achieve learning objectives and outcomes. So by ending this discussion, I would like to share to you a quote. The beauty of the world lies in the diversity of its people. So, it means that the world's beauty will be in the diversity of its people. Thank you. If you are interested on these topics, here are some sources that you can visit to broaden your knowledge. Thank you.